Turn this on. Okay, we'll see. All right. As Pastor mentioned, we're going to focus on Mount St. Helens, and soon I'll be turning that over to my wife because she's really, I would say, really an expert on Mount St. Helens, and very scientific. But she'll bring it into your layman's terms if you're not a scientist, which I'm not in that aspect. So let's go ahead and go. So, I mentioned this morning about the necessity of remembering, and Psalm 78 is a great example of that. And what does he say? That we will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. And then future generations must remember that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. Well, what are some of the things that they would declare them? Well, and they would be remembering those things that God had done for the children of Israel. But we can remember those things that God has done for us in our lives. Why remember? That they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. So God doesn't just tell us to remember, he tells us how to remember. And you all read through Joshua, I'm sure, and God told Joshua to make a stone memorial as a reminder of the crossing of the Jordan River and the Red Sea. Now, a lot of those people would have been very young if they didn't even know about they knew about the Red Sea but didn't experience it. But they would experience on a smaller scale, but certainly not insignificant, and that is to cross the Jordan River, which at the time would have been during the flood season, the spring season, where the waters were really high. It wasn't crossing a little stream. It was a lot of water coming through, but it was miraculous because they would cross it on dry land. So are these 12 standing stones happen chance or purposely placed as a memorial? And so you do a little bit of digging and you think, around in this area, there seems to be some indication perhaps there is some still standing stones. And so you have these double row of 12 standing stones at Har Karhom in southern Israel. Perhaps they could be related to that. We don't know for sure. But if you do a little more digging, you have the Medeba mosaic, and that it's a map of the Holy Land. And it's interesting that it shows around Gilgal, where the children of Israel would have crossed the Jordan River, there seems to be 12 stones pictured in this mosaic. I'll give you, see that circle there? These are 12 stones. So incredible. You think of the memorial that God did something special then. So if we all are familiar with monuments and memorials, they have their significance, don't they? And whether it has to do with our history, whether it's to do with a special event that took place in our country or in our neighborhood or whatever it may be. So if the stopping of the Jordan River was a mighty act of God worth remembering, then surely God would want the flood to be remembered too. And so there would be a lot of examples of that if that's the case. So God doesn't expect a blind leap of faith. He leaves the evidence and he makes memorials. In the ark all were safe and sound, but outside its walls all else had drowned. This beautiful world that God had made was now a swirling mud-filled sea, for God could not allow wickedness to be. Oh, how he grieved while destroying his creation, when splitting asunder its very foundation, watching layer after layer of mud and debris being laid beneath man and beast's watery grave. Oh, if only people would learn to behave. It's not hard to imagine what could have transpired, what thoughts the turbulent sea inspired. While watching the death of those who had strayed, I could almost hear God the Father say, my son, how shall we teach them to obey? And his reply, let's turn these trees to stone and preserve the animal's bone. Then as the waters from land recede, it will channel through the muddy ground, uncovering the fossils, so they'll be found. So generations that come and go will have no excuse but to know. For there in the rocks they will clearly read the story of this destructive day. They'll be reminded of their need to learn your will, and your will obey. For only by following your instruction will man be saved from utter destruction, as some were on this day. So when people forget, he sends reminders. And I think we see that, of course, with the flood, and we'll go over that in a minute. So thousands of generations have come and gone, but the story of the stones is read all wrong. Evidence of the flood now promotes Satan's lie. Geological features show millions of years. There is no God controlling, or so it appears. So man could see the folly of Satan's fairy tale. God allowed him to witness the flood on a miniature scale. Canyons carved in hours, sediment layered high, uprooted trees replanted on the bottom of the lake. All this did God orchestrate just for man's sake. In 1980, on the 18th of May, God put his mighty power on permanent display. He shook the mountain and smoke filled the sky. Then the world watched as Mount St. Helens blew. Perhaps man will now listen to the story that is true. So Carl, would you come up and share more about Mount St. Helens? Would you back up a slide?
All right, so we're going to start with this slide here. This shows what it looked like before the eruption. Two things to notice. It's capped with snow, but it's not fully capped with snow. So this was probably about May, this picture. But you see all the trees on this side of the lake, and you can barely see there's a lot of trees on the other side of the lake. So Spirit Lake was just rimmed with forest, huge, gigantic trees. Next one. All right, next one. So Sunday morning, like at 8:30 in the morning, there was an earthquake that shook the mountain and caused a huge debris avalanche to go. And this was the start of the avalanche. The thing with Mount St. Helens is they knew it was going to erupt. They had actually been measuring how far the mountain was swelling as the months were going by. So they knew pressure was building up inside, but the scientists were expecting lava, and lava would just pour out, and they had it mapped off, the area that would not be safe, but it turned out that it wasn't lava. That was super hot water that was building up inside that volcano. And so when the landslide happened and it slid away, it was like taking the lid off of a pressure cooker. And all that super hot water instantly just turned to steam and came shooting out for 9 hours. So you can see the little tip of a plane up there in the corner. That plane almost got disintegrated, but they got out of the way pretty quick. But then the landslide is just starting to happen. Next one. So that super hot water flashed into steam, and there you can see it shooting out. Next one. In one day, 2/3 of the mountain was blown away. It was just pulverized. Next one. Now, 1/4 of that landslide went sliding into Spirit Lake, and 3/4 went and filled a valley. So we'll look at Spirit Lake first, next. There you can see the edge of where that landslide is slid down into Spirit Lake. And this area used to be all trees, but all those trees were just washed into Spirit Lake, like a bulldozer just took them in. Next one. And then as the landslide slid into Spirit Lake, it caused the water to displace and go in huge waves across the lake to the other side. So those ridges that you see, that's where the waves hit and washed back in. So all those trees were washed into Spirit Lake. Next one will show you how tall those ridges stretch. That is the Statue of Liberty there in the middle. So the wave was over the top. Now, all those trees turned into a floating log mat. And the day of the eruption, it totally covered the lake. When the helicopters flew over trying to rescue the people who were trapped in the woods and whatnot, they thought the lake was gone, but it was just totally covered by logs. Next one. 30 years later, there were still floating logs. Now, when you think of the flood would have uprooted all the forest all over the world, and they'd float around on this giant mat. And that mat would have lasted a long time. Right, next one. 40 years later, there is still floating logs. And as the wind blows, the wind will just blow them from one side of the lake to the other. But all of the logs have lost their bark. The bark was long rubbed off and sank to the bottom. Next one. Here you can see a lot of lake, and then on the far end is where all the logs are because the wind blew it over. Next one. So here we're walking on those logs. That gives you an idea of the size. These were giant trees that were just bulldozed by the landslide. And all the way in the background was more and more logs. Now, Dr. Austin was wondering what's happening on the bottom of Spirit Lake. He had this theory when he studied the coal beds of Kentucky that it wasn't collecting in a swamp, but it was floating logs, and the bark was rubbing off in the float beneath the logs. And then Mount St. Helens went off, and he had his laboratory. So he went scuba diving there in Spirit Lake to find out what's happening on the bottom. Next one. This is the picture of what he drew, what he thought was happening, that the trees, when they became waterlogged, they would start sinking root first, and then bark would be falling. Right. Next one. Sure enough, there was 3 feet of bark that accumulated on the bottom of Spirit Lake. Now, it's not turning into coal, it's rotting away. You would have to bury it under a lot of heat and pressure to turn it into coal. We'd need another eruption. Right, next one. But here's the road cuts in Kentucky where you see that dark line of coal. Beneath it and above it is lime rock, full of seashells. So what the secular theory is, the area was a swamp, and peat collected in the swamp, and then the area sank and the ocean came in, and lime rock collected in the ocean. Then the land rose up, and the swamp came back, and peat collected in the swamp. Then the area went down, and the ocean came in for millions and millions of years. However, if you think about floating logs and the bark rubbing off, and then underwater mud flows are bringing in some lime rock, and then more bark is sinking, you would get all those layers very quickly. Next one. But the other thing he found out is there really are trees sitting on the bottom of Spirit Lake. They sank root first, and it looks like that's where they grew, but it's not. It's where they were planted or replanted, where they sank. Next. It's not where they grew, but it's where they sank. Next one. So here we have Yellowstone National Park, this upright tree. It is not where the tree grew, it's where the tree sank. They actually have changed the sign at Yellowstone, and they now talk about a catastrophe burying the forest millions of years ago. Okay, next one. This is a sequoia stump in Colorado. So in Colorado Springs, they have a small forest of about 23 trees that are just the stump. So imagine the force it took to uproot even the sequoia trees, floating them about until they're waterlogged, and then they sank. And once they're buried in mud, that's when they can petrify. Next one. So that was the landslide that went into Spirit Lake, but 3/4 of the landslide went and filled the Toutle Valley there beside it, Toutle River Valley. Next one. That's kind of hard to see. Can you all see that? No, probably not. Can some lights go off? That might help a little bit more. All right, so this used to be a V-shaped valley. I'll show that in the next picture. And the landslide came in and totally just filled that valley, sorry about that, and turned it into a U. And that blue part that's circled way up there, that's a newly formed lake. That was a river that flowed into this valley, but the landslide came and just totally blocked the river, so it became a lake. Next one. So here's the picture before the eruption, what it looked like with that deep V and trees growing all through it. It was filled with 600 feet of new dirt in one day. Next one. So now you can hike on that brand new dirt, and there's boulders, there's dirt, and here's this buried tree. Not where the tree grew. This tree grew somewhere near the volcano. This is where the tree rode all the debris and ended up being stopped and buried. Next one. And this one is obviously not where it grew because it's upside down. Right, so these, as the landslide was going, if you've seen a river that's flowing very swiftly, it makes little hills in the water. That's the same thing this dirt did. It was flowing so fast, it actually made energy waves that are just hills today. Next one. And buried within all this dirt were huge hunks of ice because the mountain, this erupted in May, so the mountain was covered with snow. Beneath the snow was ice from the years before. And those huge hunks of ice were buried in all the debris. And when the ice melted, that caused all these little ponds. So you can see here there's a hill, and all of a sudden that hill gets white. That's where the hill just fell in when the ice melted. And all the trees you see, that's new growth since the eruption. Next one. So there's a view from 2014, 34 years after the eruption, and you can see the size of the trees that are growing. This is really an amazing shot because most of the time it's so cloudy here, you don't get to see the volcano. But we had a beautiful, clear day. All right, next one. This looks a lot like it. Flip back one, Brian, if you would. All right. So notice the way, the steepness of the hills. Those hills were all made in one day by the avalanche. All this dirt came from that avalanche. Next one. It looks so much like this. But this picture, this is from Wisconsin. This is the area that's supposedly made by the glaciers coming down. Next one. All these boulders that are mixed up on these hills, this all came from the avalanche, not from a glacier. Next one. Here's a boulder that was also from the landslide or the avalanche. It's the same thing. Next one. This boulder was carried here by a mud flow. Next one. This is my favorite boulder. This boulder was cut out of the mountain practically as the ice was melting and the mud flow was happening. And as it tumbled down, it was rounded off. And then the mud flow continued and carved that canyon that you see. And notice how round and smooth the canyon is. That was formed by the fast-flowing mud in one day. Next one. So what caused the mud flows? These mud flows were on the backside of the volcano. So while you have the avalanche happening and the steam blast happening, on the backside, the snow is all melting and sliding off into mud flows. So the eruption happened in May, and that top picture is a picture of May, not in August. Had it happened in August, it wouldn't have been covered with quite so much snow. Next one. So here's where a mud flow came through and totally took out the forest and left all these boulders in its path. Now, a lot of people would look at a boulder field like this and say, oh, this is where glaciers came through. And when the glaciers melted, they dropped all the boulders. But this was formed in one day by a mud flow. Next one. And that just shows you the size of these boulders that are scattered about. Next one. Now this area, if you look at the right, all those trees are old growth trees. The trees on the backside of the volcano, they weren't really hurt by the blast at all. And then the trees on the right, that's all new growth trees. They have grown up since the eruption. But this path that you see right there, it stays clear. Trees will never grow here. Anybody got a guess as to why? Yes. Rats, that's the wrong slide. It is a seasonal river. Sorry, all right. Yeah, so when the snow melts in the spring, it forms a rushing river that takes out any trees that happen to grow. I didn't read the top. All right, next one, Brian. All right, so the forest was unaffected by the blast, but the canyon that you see here was carved by the mud flow. Next, again, in one day. So Mount St. Helens shows how quickly geology, especially the topography, the top surface of the earth, can quickly be changed. Next one. Now, 2 years later, the snow falls again, the crater started filling up with snow. 2 years later, there was a very small eruption, not enough to do much damage, but it did melt all that snow. And the water could not be contained in the crater, so it went over the lip. Next. So the top picture shows right after the eruption, then the snow started building up, then the small eruption happened that melted the snow. And can you tell that there's a canyon cut through there? And can you see the little bitty stream? I think the next one will point an arrow to the stream. Let's see, Brian. All right, that shows where the water came pouring through, and the water carved through this canyon in one day. So it turned that solid rock into mud very, very quickly. And that shows how quickly fast-flowing water can grind rock into sediment. And here's the arrow pointing to the little stream, the little river, right? Typically, geology would look at this and say, that little river over millions of years cut the canyon. But Mount St. Helens showed, no, a mighty rush of water cut the canyon. That little river comes from the melting snow today. Next one. However, I think I can't figure the years, probably 15 years, I pointed to that canyon and I thought that was the canyon that was cut in a day. Then I found out, no, that was just the mouth. You see that square over on the right side? That's just the little mouth of that canyon. That whole 600-foot gapping hole was all taken out in a day. Isn't that crazy? You can only see this angle if you hike down into the valley, so you can't see it from the observatory. So for years, I didn't know how big this canyon actually was. Next one. But then that mud flow went through the valley that the debris avalanche had filled in 2 years later and cut this canyon system through it. Next one. Again, you can see a little river flowing through the bottom, but that little river had nothing to do with the carving of the canyon. The mud flow came through quickly and carved the canyon in a day. Next one. This was an aerial view. You see the two waterfalls that are there, and all that mud was taken out in just the one day, or the sediment, the dirt. That mud flow traveled on for 20 miles, cutting this canyon through the valley. Now back then, flip back one more, Brian. Whoops, I'm sorry, forward one. Here you can see the canyon really well and the river really well. And the trees that you see are new growth since the eruption. Today, you can't see that canyon because the trees have grown up so much it hides it. And today, they actually have changed the signs there at Mount St. Helens and talk about the river cutting the canyon. And it boils my blood to think about it because it's obviously did not happen that way, right? But it was 50 years ago, and a lot of people don't realize how it was really cut. Next one. So here you see a hill that was just cut in half as the mud flow came through. So again, it started as a V-shaped valley lined with trees. The debris avalanche filled it in with 600 feet of brand new dirt, and it left all the little hills on top. 2 years later, the canyon was carved through those hills by the mud flow. That's what it looked like the first time we were able to hike in the area in 2010. Trees were just starting to come back. It was looking like the surface of the moon. 40 years looks like that. Isn't that crazy? People used to say there's no way that Noah's Ark could have happened because it would have Noah's flood, it would have so obliterated the earth that it would have taken hundreds of years to recuperate and to grow plants again and for anybody to survive there. But Mount St. Helens shows how quickly the land can rejuvenate. But the signs there talk about it's almost a let's worship the earth because it regrew rather than the creator for making it to where it could regrow. Right, next one. Yeah, the Mother Earth stuff. It's very deep, the Mother Earth worship there at the Mount St. Helens. So again, the river didn't cut the canyon. The landslide filled the valley, and then the mud flow cut the canyon. Next one. And now today, trees block the view. Next one. It's great that the trees grew back. Now, but this was soon after the canyon was cut, and you notice how there is no trees. All right, the one guy, the little people are up there for scale to give you an idea of how deep this canyon really is. The one guy says, this is one steep drop off. I wonder how that little stream managed to carve the canyon, right? Because that's the way people think. That's not the way it happened. Next one. So when you go to places like Yellowstone and Artist Point, where they say for millions of years the Yellowstone River has been cutting this canyon, do they really know that? No, it could have very easily happened quickly. Next one. Now, here's the interesting thing. When you hike down into that canyon and you look at the side, you see all the different types of layers, right? And compare it to the size of the person, right? All of these layers were laid very, very quickly. Like the middle layer there was laid from a proclastic flow. That's just hot ash and steam that just flowed through the valley very quickly, laying those layers. But look at how fine they are in the next picture. You can see, scientists used to say you count the layers and that tells you how they formed, that it was layer upon layer, year after year, like the rings of a tree. So they wanted to compare Earth's layers to tree rings. But you can't do that because all of these layers were laid very fast. When you have fast-flowing water filled with sediment, that sediment is going to sort into layers. Next one. So if these layers at Mount St. Helens formed quickly, can we be certain that the Badlands took millions of years? Could fast-flowing water have quickly laid those layers too? And if the layers were laid quickly, how do we know how old the fossils are? So the way they date a fossil is how deep in the ground do you find it. The deeper it is, the older it is. Next one. So we got to go on a rim hike with Dr. Austin. Have any of you heard of Dr. Austin? Okay, a few. All right. So it was quite exciting to be able to go on this hike. We and 50 other people went on this hike. Right. Next one. That picture was taken at the end of the hike, and I was one of the last to make it back up out. That's why we ended up with Dr. Austin at the end. All right, next one. So there's a group of us, and it was really cool. We would hike for a while, and then we would stop, and he would tell us about all the different things that we were seeing. Then we'd hike a little bit more. But on the way back up, it was just hike. No more stopping, no more talking. A very long walk back up. Next one. All right, so these are the 7 events of the eruption. First, we started with that earthquake that shook the mountain that caused the landslide or the debris avalanche. The avalanche caused that giant wave that washed trees into Spirit Lake. Then you had the steam explosion. As soon as that landslide slid away, that super hot water turned into steam and came out. And then the snow was melting on the backside of the volcano, forming the mud flows, and you had proclastic flows, and then all this ash in the air just fell out, the airfall. Next one. That's an example of a steam blast crater, which was really interesting. In that debris avalanche, there was huge blocks of ice. And the further on down in the valley, it melted more slowly and turned into ponds. But closer to the volcano, this is such hot, hot ash. It melted very quickly, and it turned into steam that just shot up. So it was like little eruptions. And it left those cool little reels, I'm saying that wrong, ridges, like that. Right, next one. Now, Dr. Austin, on one of his hikes up on top of the volcano, he decided while he was up there that he would take some of that brand new lava rock. So what you see circled in red, that's the new dome. And when it was 10-year-old rock, he got samples, he sent it off to laboratories. Next one. And they came back 350,000 years old. Okay. So you cannot trust radiometric dating. It just, because they don't know how much of the minerals were there in the first place. Next one. So the age is determined by the rate of decay. You've got potassium turning into argon. But what they didn't realize is there was already argon in the rock. So it looked older than what it was. But we don't know, like today they use uranium turning into lead. But what if there was already lead in the rock? So that would throw your date off. All right, next one. So during a lunch break, we hiked down to a certain point, but some people hiked in further. Next one will show you the circle of the people. Whoops, you had it there for a second. Okay, so you see the little group of people that are hiking on further? They want to redo Dr. Austin's picture. Next one. So on the one side, that's Dr. Austin's picture showing you all the layers. So they were hiking down to that same ridge that they could get a picture at. Next. But once they got down there, they had to hike way up the side of this cliff before they could get to the spot where Dr. Austin was. So what I thought was a deep canyon was really only a little part of it. That canyon is extremely deep. And again, who can tell me how quickly this canyon formed? One day. One day. Next one. So I thought that showed how deep the canyon was, and that is pretty deep if you compare that person all the way up the side there. right? But that's how deep it really is. Okay, canyons can be carved fast. It takes fast-moving mud, fast-moving water. Now, concretions. How many of you have been back to the little museum we have set up? Okay, a few of you. We've got some concretions out there, and you can pick them up and you can hold them. These concretions formed when the ash would fall in a stream, and the eddy would collect it around, and it hardened it into a rock. And you can have these little concretions. So they were formed by hot ash falling in twirling water. Right, next one. But we find concretions all over the place. Here's some in a road cut in Kentucky. And there is a whole row of concretions, and compare the size to that pickup truck. Next one. These are some interesting concretions. This is Rock City, Kansas. So imagine that's the roof of a building that you see up at the top of the corner. These are some huge rocks. Let's see if we have Brian climbing on one. Next one. Yes, that shows you how the size of these. So if they come from sediment and ash being caught in little eddies, imagine the amount of water it took and the spin it took to collect these. Next one. Then there's the hilltop concretions in South Dakota. Next. And there you can see how big they are. There's the kids up at the top. They have like 50 different ideas. There's no consensus. They don't know, but they're totally rounded rocks, some of them. Yeah, they think somehow it was formed in groundwater. That's the main thing. Yeah. But a flood, you can see, because the flood's not just this gentle water covers the earth. It's swirling, moving water. Next. So the unexplainable becomes clear in the light of the flood. Right, and again, first the circle there, that's her daughter Rebecca. That gives you an idea of how huge this is. This is called balanced rock, and it truly is balanced there. First, the sediment was laid during the flood. Then when God raised the land and lowered the sea, the water rushed off. And when the water's rushing off, that's where all the canyons are being carved and the sediment washed away. Next one. Canyons speak of catastrophe, of floodwaters rushing to the sea. Fossils speak of tragic death, the drowning of animals that once held breath. Coal beds speak of floating logs, not millions of years of swamps and bogs. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God, and you need to obey. Okay. Right. Brian, if you want to end that off.
So Mount St. Helens is a great example of how things can change very rapidly. And, God created a perfect world, and all that changed in it because Adam and Eve chose to disobey him and follow what Satan had to say. And so that perfect world or perfect utopia is no longer here. But Adam and Eve, because they disobeyed God and they followed Satan, that there would be a lot of repercussions and that is eventually that the world would be cursed. In Genesis 3, it talks about the world being cursed. But that, even with that, in Genesis 3:15, he says, basically, you are going, the Creator himself is going to come to this world, and he's going to die in your place. And all the animal sacrifices that would be, there would be a picture of Christ, instituted by God from the beginning. And I'm so glad that he did that, because it would be a reminder not only of their sin, but of the coming Messiah who would sacrifice himself. So after 2,000 years of man's wickedness, this brought God's wrath. And that, of course, would lead to the worldwide flood, there's so much evidence that supports that. And then God came to earth, and he died on the cross to save us from our sins. And one day, God will destroy this world again. Now, we know it's going to be by fire. We don't know what that entails, but that will happen, and because he said it would. And so that could be right around the corner. God said to Noah a long time ago, all over this world water would flow. These wicked people all must die, but so will the cattle, beasts, and birds that fly. Canyons speak of catastrophe, of floodwaters rushing to the sea. Fossils speak of tragic death, the drowning of animals that once held breath. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God and you need to obey. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God and you need to obey. You have heard the story of Noah's Ark. Some say it's history, but most think it's a lark. You can bet it happened just the way God said. He even left the story in the rocks to be read. Coal beds speak of floating logs, not millions of years of swamps and bogs. Strata speak of a fast mud flow, not accumulation, gradual and slow. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God and you need to obey. Some use the rocks to promote Satan's lie. God didn't send a flood causing everything to die. So God used Mount St. Helens that we could know strata really forms from a fast mud flow. Yes, canyons speak of catastrophe, as at Mount St. Helens we clearly see. And coal beds speak of floating logs, for at Spirit Lake there's no swamps or bogs. Oh, to those who will listen, the rocks will say, there really is a God and you need to obey. Yes, to those who will listen, can't you hear them shout, there really is a God, and of that there's no doubt. That should be, and so, all right. Thank you.